official
reshape the
development
social
assistance for
fabric,
animal
the
health
political
fell
landscape, and the
23%
graveyard
in
registry of Western
2025.
Canada.
In
And
Alberta,
that,
the
of
planned
course, we were talking
reduction
about
in
the
AFC
toxic drug
spending through
epidemic.
2029 suggests the
Specifically, we're
burden
going
of
to be tracking the
biosecurity
state of the
is
crisis
going to
inside of the
shift
province
increasingly
of
towards the
Alberta, a
individual
territory that has
producers
become
and
ground
the
zero
private
for a radical,
insurers.
sweeping
Now,
policy
when we
pivot
look at this
known
spending,
globally as the Alberta
the
model.
planned spending
Now, if
reductions for
you
the
or
fiscal
someone
years
else
this
is
year,
in
as I said, it's
crisis
about
and needs to get
$112
assistance both
million
in the U.S. or
for
in
the
Canada,
AFC
there
spending
is
reductions.
a national
Next year,
helpline in
the
both
fiscal year
nations that you can
2027 to
call, and it is
2028, looking at a further
988.
reduction of
So
$80
again, if you are
million.
in crisis or
And then
someone you care about
2028
is
to
in crisis,
2029,
both mental
another
health or addiction
154.
services that are needed, by all means, call that number 988. For those in other nations, I encourage you to Google your local mental health lines or your addiction resource lines, and you can do that on Google or other search engines and find them, such as amazing organizations in the UK as known as the Samaritans, and so many others. So again, if you are someone that you know are in crisis, by all means, there's no harm in reaching out. It takes a lot of willpower and a lot of support to get away from addiction and to deal with mental health issues. So again, we encourage you to call 988 if you are in need. By all means, it's not a sign of weakness. It's actually quite the opposite. It's a sign of strength that you want to empower yourself and to recapture control of your life. So again, if you are in crisis, dial that number 988, and that's mental health or addiction resources that are available both in Canada and in the United States. Those are national toll-free numbers, so by all means, use them as you can. As we start the program tonight, we've all probably known someone in our lives that has struggled with addiction issues. Some of them may not be with us any longer. Some of them may be still struggling or have successfully completed recovery and are working to rebuild their lives. Or maybe they're further down the road. But the addiction and that powerful magnetism to the human mind is not something that ever goes away 100%. People who have been clean for years may still find themselves triggered by certain events, certain smells, certain sounds, certain environments. So again, it is a very important topic that we discuss tonight here on Primetime Live. Once again, you are watching us on Jess FM and Jess TV. And of course, our program wouldn't be quite as possible without the support of our episode sponsor. Once again, Carry Movers Limited, serving Western Canada for local and long distance moves for over 20 years. Canadian owned and operated. You can find them online at www.karymovers.com. Now, as we get started tonight, I think that it's important for those who may have addiction issues or are experimenting or considering experimenting, especially when we're looking at the younger crowd. I wanted to show a video, and this is not necessarily of Alberta. It's actually Vancouver. And this is what the streets looked like just a few years ago, and still a lot of the same today. We're going to be monitoring to see what the city does now that FIFA World Cup games will be attended in Vancouver, to see how they deal with the homeless and, of course, those suffering from addiction and mental health issues. So let's take a look at what those streets look like just a few years ago and right up till recently in some areas. So again, it is a horrific issue, but I think that it is really important to show you, if you're not familiar with these areas, what it looks like and how far down people have fallen and how much and how desperate they are in need of the help and the resources. When we talk about recovery and even detox, there can be a long wait for those service beds to become available. Some of the programs are not fit for certain people. There are a lot of different holistic approaches to addiction recovery, and a part of that is dealing with what it is that people are dealing with mentally, whether that's a mental health issue or emotional trauma and other issues that lead them to the place that they're at. And so again, not every program fits each person. And that's why it's important to be aware of the different programs available. And that's why we'll also be delving into the programs in Alberta, because they take that more holistic approach to addiction treatment and recovery. So again, we thought that was important to show as well. So let's take a look. I'm going to kind of fast forward through parts of this video just so that you can catch and visualize what the streets are like at times in Vancouver. But also, if you want to watch the full documentary that this video clip comes from, you're welcome to watch that at truecrimeandjusticetv.com. It is a ProPix Canada media production, and more than happy to share that with you. So again, truecrimeandjusticetv.com if you want to see this full documentary. We won't be playing a lot of the vocabulary or the narration with this. I just wanted you to see the actual images of what those streets look like. Again, you can see the tents are lined up on the sidewalks outside of local businesses. There are open and closed businesses and other businesses that have gone out of business for the simple fact that having these tents set up in front of their storefronts or their commercial sites obviously doesn't facilitate a growing business or being able to bring in customers at a pace that they need to do so in order to pay the rent, pay the bills. And of course, with the heightened risk of having this concentration of people dealing with the mental health crisis and addiction crisis, of course, that increases crime and other issues of safety around the neighborhood, therefore pushing up insurance rates for businesses as well. And that's something that a lot of people don't realize, is how impacted these businesses are by this pandemic or this epidemic of addiction and lack of recovery programs for those that are out there. There are some that have options, but some that don't. So again, I don't like to lump everybody under one roof when it comes to the different complex issues that are facing these individuals who are suffering from homelessness, from mental health or addiction issues. There's constantly overdoses that are happening on our streets, and people that have families, whether they are parents, whether they are brothers or sisters, whether they are sons or daughters. The reality is that there are people of all ages, all income brackets, all socioeconomic backgrounds that are suffering at the hands of the addiction that is, the opioid pandemic or epidemic, and other instances that we'll get into in just a short while here. But as you can see, the streets are just littered with these tents and garbage, and it is a shame to see that we can't do better for individuals in need than to have them sleeping in the streets like this. And some of the areas here that you do find these tent towns, some call them tent cities, but I call it a tent town in this aspect. And some of it's just for the safety of being in numbers. Sometimes it's the safety of being in well-lit areas, and other times it's just a matter of convenience or others who may be hiding from different situations in their own life, whether that's hiding from the police or others, that kind of take refuge in these tent areas and use them to hide and to avoid law enforcement. And that's the shame of it here. You can see just this part here is a drive through the area. And it is a shame, not only for the businesses, but for the individuals who are legitimately in need of services. So that's why I thought that we would spend some time tonight to understand the opioid crisis, the overdose crisis, the carfentanil, and all of that we are going to look at. Because at the end of the day, again, these are family members, these are human beings, and a society is only as strong and as powerful as the way they treat their most vulnerable. So again, that is an important issue to look at. In saying so, of course, we also need to understand what it is that has brought this opioid epidemic and the carfentanil and all of these other issues, including, heroin or methamphetamines and so many other drugs that are rampant on our streets, and what has brought them to this point of crisis that we're in today. And we're not just talking about here in Canada. It is a global issue. It is not confined by oceans. It's not confined by borders. And it sure isn't confined by where you're located on this planet. It has reached everywhere. And whether that's got to do with the cartels and the criminal gangs, the lack of enforcement or lack of ability to enforce in some nations, it has grown to astronomical levels. Again, if you're in crisis in Canada or the US, call that number on the screen, 988, and you can get assistance both in Canada and in the US, and that line is available 24 hours a day. So let's take a look at another documentary portion, a clip of documentary, again on truecrimeandjusticetv.com, because this explains the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma and how it really brought this overdose crisis to the streets, whether that's in Canada, the US, or worldwide. It is a big deal to look at the linkage between where we are today with the overdose crisis and the big pharma connection. So let's take a look at that, because I think that it is very important to understand where we've come from on this and how we got to this point, and where the system has just tremendously failed. And when I say that, I mean the big pharma, government regulatory systems, the medical bodies, and so forth. So again, to understand that, I think is a big part of what we need to view before we move on to the rest of tonight's program. So let's take a look at this video here. We won't watch it all, but we will watch some of it so you can understand the history of big pharma in the crisis that we have today.
Profit from OxyContin, they aggressively marketed it, pushing it onto doctors and patients.
Let me just restart that.
What if I told you that one family has played a significant role in the international opioid crisis? A crisis that has devastated communities globally, taking countless lives and leaving a trail of despair in its wake. This isn't a tale of an anonymous, faceless entity, but rather a story about the Sackler family, the owners of Purdue Pharma, the makers of OxyContin. OxyContin, a powerful opioid painkiller, has been at the heart of this crisis. It's a drug that's been overprescribed, misused, and abused, leading to addiction, overdoses, and all too often, death. But behind this drug, behind this crisis, stands the Sackler family. The Sacklers, a name synonymous with philanthropy, with their fingerprints on some of the world's most esteemed institutions. They've funded wings at the Louvre, endowed professorships at Yale, and their name adorns galleries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Their wealth, seemingly boundless, their influence, far-reaching. But peel back the veneer of philanthropy, and a different image emerges. An image of a family whose wealth has been largely built on the sale of OxyContin, a drug that has wreaked havoc on millions of lives. The Sacklers didn't just profit from OxyContin, they aggressively marketed it, pushing it onto doctors and patients while downplaying its addictive potential. The contrast between the public image of the Sacklers and their involvement in the opioid crisis is stark. On one hand, they are seen as patrons of the arts, benefactors of science, and pillars of society. On the other, they are seen as architects of a crisis that has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. In recent years, the family's involvement in the opioid crisis has come under scrutiny. Lawsuits have been filed, settlements reached, and their name, once associated with philanthropy, is now linked to one of the most significant public health crises of our time. So, who are the Sacklers, and how did they amass their enormous wealth? Stay tuned as we delve into the history of this family, their controversial business practices, and their role in the international opioid crisis. The Sackler family's journey to wealth and influence started with three brothers, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond Sackler. Born to immigrant parents in the bustling borough of Brooklyn, New York, the brothers were instilled with an unwavering work ethic and a drive to succeed from an early age. Each brother pursued a path in medicine, obtaining degrees from some of the world's most prestigious institutions. Arthur, the eldest, became a pioneer in medical advertising, using his knowledge of psychiatry to craft messages that resonated with physicians. Mortimer and Raymond, on the other hand, delved into the world of pharmaceuticals, driven by a fascination with the potential of medicine to change lives. In the late 1950s, the brothers made a bold move that would set the stage for their future empire. They acquired a small pharmaceutical company, Purdue Frederick, which they would later transform into Purdue Pharma. This company, unbeknownst to them, would become the cornerstone of their wealth and the source of their infamy. At Purdue, the Sacklers saw an opportunity to revolutionize pain management. They developed a potent new drug, OxyContin, which they claimed could provide extended relief from pain with a minimal risk of addiction. With their keen understanding of marketing, they promoted OxyContin aggressively to doctors and patients, painting it as a miracle solution for chronic pain. And so, the seeds were sown. The Sacklers' pharmaceutical empire grew exponentially, with OxyContin becoming one of the most prescribed drugs of its time. The family's fortune ballooned into the billions, placing them amongst the wealthiest in the world. Yet as their wealth accumulated, so did the number of OxyContin prescriptions. And with it, a dark undercurrent began to emerge, a wave of addiction that would soon grow into a full-blown crisis. With the introduction of OxyContin, the Sacklers' fortunes began to skyrocket, but so did the opioid crisis. OxyContin, hailed as a miracle drug for pain management, soon revealed its dark side. The drug, marketed as a panacea for pain, would soon prove to be a Pandora's box of problems. You see, OxyContin was aggressively promoted by Purdue Pharma, the pharmaceutical giant owned by the Sackler family. They painted a rosy picture of a world where pain could be managed effectively without the risk of addiction. But behind the glossy marketing campaigns and high-profile endorsements, there was a grim reality. The fact is, OxyContin was highly addictive, leading to a surge in opioid addiction cases. Imagine a substance so potent that it could ensnare its users in a web of dependency with just a few doses. That was OxyContin. Their aggressive marketing strategies, coupled with a lack of clear communication about the addiction risks, had a catastrophic impact. To make matters worse, the widespread use of OxyContin led to a sharp increase in overdose deaths. It was as if a silent killer was on the loose, claiming lives indiscriminately. The victims were not just the addicts themselves, but their families, friends, and communities too. They were all caught in the destructive path of OxyContin's wave, a wave that seemed to grow bigger and more terrifying with each passing day. What was equally shocking was the denial and deflection from Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family. As the evidence piled up, they continued to promote OxyContin with the same fervor, seemingly indifferent to the suffering they were causing. They were more interested in protecting their profits than the well-being of their customers. It was a classic case of putting profits before people, a sad testament to the corporate greed that often goes unchecked.
So again, that kind of gives you a background of the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma and how they ended up creating one of the worst drug addiction and overdose crises epidemics that the world has ever seen. And of course, now we look at that and the accountability factor is pretty much, just a joke in comparison to the lives that they have destroyed. And but again, that was part of a documentary that is available on truecrimeandjusticetv.com. And there are other documentaries on there, short ones that highlight the impacts on first responders, the impacts on families and on human trafficking and other topics. So again, I encourage you to check out truecrimeandjusticetv.com to see some of those documentaries and other true crime programs if that's a genre that you enjoy. Now let's get back to the program here, because For nearly a decade, the Canadian narrative surrounding illicit substance use has been a polarized war of methodologies. And when I say that, it's not just one in Canada or the US or, one side or the other. On one side, of course, you have the public health directives leaning heavily into structural harm reduction, supervised consumption sites, and safe supply. And that's something that we saw a lot of here in the Metro Vancouver region. Now, on the other, there's a systemic insistence on robust, immediate, and structured paths to recover and total abstinence. Today, we're going to be reporting here. It's May 21st, 2026, just in case you're watching this in a repeat so you can get the context as to where we are. Now, Alberta finds itself at a historical crossroads. The province has engineered a monumental shift away from the conventional models. They're dismantling standalone safe injection infrastructure and building an enterprise of treatment spaces. But what do the numbers actually tell us? How does Alberta's reality compare to the compounding tragedies in British Columbia and Ontario? And most importantly, who is surviving this war? I think you'll be surprised at how effective it appears that Alberta's programs are being in this reduction of overdose deaths at almost twice the rate of the national average of Canada. So when I say that, I mean that they are having, in terms of a percentage reduction, they are twice as successful at reducing the numbers of overdoses and toxicity-related deaths than the rest of the nation. So a huge endorsement to Alberta, and kudos to them for taking this approach and kind of shifting out of what everybody else is doing to try and find a solution that works, because as the old saying goes, that the definition of insanity is to keep repeating the same thing over and over but expecting different results. And that's exactly what I think has happened within the treatment and recovery programs. A lot of them, I feel, are financial windfalls for certain individuals or organizations when they are not delivering the services or the efficacy that they are promising. So again, I give great credit to the government of Alberta for stepping outside of that box and trying something different, and one that seems to be working. And before we unlock the investigative dossiers, we want to take a moment to acknowledge again the corporate partners who make this rigorous independent journalism possible here on Jess Tv. Tonight's broadcast of Primetime Live is brought to you again, as usual, by Carry Movers Limited. Whether you're moving in your neighborhood or relocating your entire corporate office across the country, you can always be sure that Carry Movers has your best interest and your safety at heart. Carry Movers handles your transition with the utmost precision, safety, and reliability, and they know that a move isn't just about transporting physical assets. It's about moving your life forward cleanly and seamlessly. Visit them today at www.karymovers.com. That's karymovers.com to plan your next journey with the professionals who care. We thank Carry Movers Limited for their dedicated support of ethical investigative storytelling. Now, let's get back to the program here, ladies and gentlemen, and we're going to start with some hard data. We're going to begin on the front lines of the Wild Rose province, evaluating where we stand today compared to the historic dark years of the pandemic, because that had a big impact. So let's start with the front lines of the Wild Rose province. To understand the current status of the drug problem in Alberta, one must understand how the landscape fractured. And I think that video at the beginning of the show about Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family gave you a bit of that. But we also need to look at how the landscape fractured between 2020 and 2023, as drug poisonings in the province of Alberta soared to numbers previously deemed unthinkable. In the 2021 year alone, Alberta lost an average of 4 individuals every single day to accidental illicit drug poisonings or overdoses. Fentanyl became the absolute baseline of the unregulated market, and that was implicated in upwards of 94% of all opioid-related fatalities in Alberta. Now, let's fast forward to the immediate past and our current reality in 2026. The year 2024 and first half of 2025 brought the first significant mathematical reprieve in nearly a decade. Public Health Agency of Canada and the provincial surveillance numbers confirmed that Alberta led the country with an unprecedented 38% decline in apparent opioid-related toxicity deaths throughout 2024 compared to 2023. Now, that decline was more than the Canadian national average drop of 17%. Huge numbers. So when we look at the statistical insight, the 2024 to 2025 data cascade is that national death rate reductions in Canada in 2024, again, were 17% on a downward trend. Alberta death rate reduction was 38% drop, and that was leading all major provinces. And then, of course, we saw the carfentanil spike in 2025. Between January and May of 2025, 68% of all recorded provincial opioid deaths involved carfentanil, up from a mere 10% the previous year. So again, huge numbers. Now, when we look at that, we can look at the localization in Edmonton, where carfentanil presence surged from 17% to 78% in the same 2025 window, highlighting a rapidly mutating chemical profile. It was astronomically climbing. But while the initial data from 2024 and the first half of 2025 indicated fewer total bodies entering the provincial morgues, the underbelly of the unregulated drug market responded with extreme chemical hostility. The drop in numbers was not driven by a magically clean street supply, but instead by macro-systemic changes in provincial interventions and the stabilization of chronic user population. However, the poison itself became infinitely more concentrated. That again, enter carfentanil. This is a synthetic analog of fentanyl, and it's estimated to be 100 times more potent than fentanyl itself and 10,000 times more potent than morphine. Street samples that were seized, sorry about that. Now, the street samples that were seized in the Edmonton region, as well as Red Deer, revealed an alarming reality. Carfentanil contamination and fatal overdoses skyrocketed from 10% in late 2024 to a staggering 68% in the first half of 2025. In Edmonton, that metric reached a catastrophic 78%. This tells us that even if fewer Albertans are actively using unregulated street drugs, those who are, they are playing Russian roulette with a weapon that has every single chamber loaded. That is the facts. Those are the realities of what's happening. And then we can look at going from the prescription pad to the toxic streets, the historical shift. And to truly comprehend how Alberta arrived at this point, we must conduct a historical autopsy of the crisis. The problem did not emerge overnight. It evolved through three distinct, calculated waves over the last quarter of a century. The first wave began in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and that was the one that we started the show with, talking about the Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family, because that was driven by aggressive pharmaceutical marketing and widespread overprescribing of synthetic opioids, most notably OxyContin. When regulators and health authorities clamped down on prescription pads in the early 2010s and reformulations made pills harder to crush and abuse, a massive, physically dependent customer base was cut off from safe supply channels. This created, of course, a void. The structural void triggered the second wave. The mass introduction of illicit black market heroin, which was rapidly replaced by cheap, highly profitable, domestically pressed illicit fentanyl around 2013 and 2014. Fentanyl completely severed the link between dose and predictability. In Alberta, this coincided brutally with the macroeconomic realities of the province. The oil patch boom and bust cycles created unique compounding factors. High-paying, physically exhausted labor roles in remote camps led to widespread self-medication for chronic pain and isolation. When the economic downturns hit, thousands of workers faced sudden unemployment. They faced financial ruin and entrenched substance use disorders. The crisis migrated aggressively from urban alleyways deep into the heart of rural Alberta places like Grand Prairie, Fort McMurray, Medicine Hat, and even Lloydminster. When we look at the trauma index for Alberta's accelerated harms, we can see that between 2013 and 2017 was the emergency department visits due to opioid poisonings increased 165% in Alberta, outstripping Ontario's increase of 144% during that same baseline years. In 2019, a base year was recorded for Alberta, recording 626 opioid-related deaths. In 2021, the pandemic peak, accidental drug poisonings skyrocketed to 1,623 deaths, nearly 160% increase in 24 months, deeply worsened by the isolation and pandemic service disruptions. So yes, it did have a major impact. And by the time the third wave hit during the COVID-19 pandemic, the illicit market has shifted from simple fentanyl to multi-substance adulteration. Street drugs were now routinely mixed with benzodiazepines, creating what clinicians call benzodope. This presents a terrifying clinical challenge. Benzodiazepines do not respond to naloxone. This is the standard opioid overdose reversal drug. A person overdosing on the benzodope remains completely unresponsive to traditional emergency protocols, forcing EMS teams to rely on immediate, prolonged respiratory intubation and ventilation on the street. Now, this historical context brings us to the ultimate policy divergence. How does Alberta's approach square up against the rest of the country? Let's look at that next. Once again, a quick sponsor recognition. As we pause for a brief commercial interlude, let us remind you that, of course, life transitions require steady hands. Carry Movers Limited stands as Alberta and British Columbia's premier choice for residential, commercial, and long-distance relocation services. Known for transparent pricing, meticulous packing protocols, and exceptional customer service, Carry Movers removes the physical and mental stress of logistics from your shoulders. Don't leave your valuable belongings to chance, ladies and gentlemen. Trust the legacy of care built by a team that moves you forward. Explore their services and availability at www.carrymovers.com. That's K-A-R-Y, movers.com. And you can reach out to them for a free quote. For long distance, you can get a flat rate written quote so that you know what your price is before you even get started. Let's move on here to the crossroads, ladies and gentlemen, the Alberta model versus the Canadian landscape. Now, welcome back. To truly measure the magnitude of Alberta's drug problem, we must analyze it relative to the rest of Canada. According to the Public Health Agency, one of Canada's national surveillance data sets, updated through March 2026, over 55,000 apparent opioid toxicity deaths occurred across this country between January 2016 and late 2025. It's a mass casualty event running in slow motion. Something that we need to understand is still an issue and should be a major priority for politicians and everyone else. Historically, British Columbia, Alberta, and Ontario have actually borne the absolute brunt of this crisis, consistently accounting for roughly 78% of all national toxicity deaths. Nationally, the epidemic remains heavily concentrated among males who comprise 74% of victims, and individuals aged 30 to 49% who make up over half of all fatalities. Furthermore, 70% of these national opioid deaths also involved co-intoxication stimulants, typically methamphetamine or cocaine. But here is where the road forks dramatically. British Columbia committed heavily into harm reduction and that thesis, pioneering safe consumption sites implementing prescribed, safer supply programs, and launching a high-profile pilot project that decriminalized small amounts of personal possession. While BC experienced a temporary rapid decline in fatalities in late 2024 and early 2025 due to the shifts in unregulated concentrations, their raw numbers have historically remained the highest in the developed world per capita. And I'll repeat that, remained the highest in the developed world per capita for British Columbia. That was with public disorder prompting significant legislative rollbacks on the public use. Alberta looked at those national trends and rejected the harm reduction consensus. The United Conservative government branded their policy framework the Alberta Recovery Model. They froze funding for standalone supervised consumption sites, instituted strict identity tracking rules for existing harm reduction infrastructure, and began aggressively transitioning the entire apparatus towards a recovery-oriented system of care. When we look at the national mortality profiles and toxicity burdens per 100,000, Alberta's toxicity footprint, despite its 2024 statistical improvements, Alberta's drug poisoning rate has historically hovered around 39.4 deaths per 100,000 people, nearly double the Canadian national baseline average of 20.8 per 100,000. And then you have the disparity. Alberta records the second highest rate of apparent opioid toxicity deaths in the entire federation, trailing only British Columbia, signaling that despite extensive policy pivots, the overall toxicity burden remains deeply entrenched. Proponents of the Alberta model point proudly to the 2024 results that 38% collapse in opioid deaths was heralded as a definitive proof that reorienting the system away from harm reduction works. Critics, however, warn that the model risks hiding the true scope of the crisis. They point to escalating hospital admissions and the trends that followed structural closures of the localized facilities. When we look closer at how this architectural transformation of healthcare is playing out on the ground, the simple fact is that the execution of the Alberta model required a complete institutional teardown. In 2024 and 2025, the provincial government fractured the single monolithic health authority, and that was known as the Alberta Health Services. They split it into 4 distinct operational sectors. Out of this administrative demolition came Recovery Alberta. This is a highly specialized, standalone mental health and addiction delivery organization backed by a massive $1.55 billion provincial budget allocation. Now, the core architecture of Recovery Alberta rests on massive capital investments to expand capacity. The province committed, sorry folks, I just had to double check that. So, as I was saying, the province committed $350 million to build 11 state-of-the-art recovery communities. These are long-term, live-in residential treatment complexes designed specifically to provide intensive medical, psychological, and vocational rehab for up to a year. 4 of those flagship communities are already active in Calgary, Red Deer, Lethbridge, and Gunn. The remaining facilities, including 5 developed in direct partnership with First Nations communities, are on track for complete structural build-out by 2027. Simultaneously, the province has executed a systemic phase-out of traditional overdose prevention sites. In April of 2025, 9 out of 10 existing safe injection sites across Alberta were officially transitioned into HEART hubs. HEART is an acronym for Health and Recovery Target Hubs. Very important. But the philosophy behind a HEART hub is integration. Rather than simply providing a clean space to inject illicit substances, these hubs embed primary medical care, mental health counseling, transitional housing support, and direct pipelines into addiction treatment under one single roof. For example, when the controversial standalone overdose prevention site in Red Deer was shut down on March the 31st, 2025, it forced a complete realignment of local services. When we look at the case study analysis, the Red Deer closure mechanics were an independent clinical review. Tracking the closures of the Red Deer overdose prevention site revealed complex public health dynamics. First, there was the OAT uptake acceleration. And OAT is the opioid agonist treatment. Following the closure, the proportion of local, unhoused, and vulnerable service users entering opioid agonist treatment rose significantly to 16.1%. Then there was the clinical backlash. However, the same tracking data that we've talked about verified a small but highly statistically significant increase in weekly hospital admissions among former service users compared to control groups in Lethbridge. This confirms that eliminating acute harm reduction safe spaces causes immediate displacement and ripples into regional acute care emergency departments. So again, every system is not perfect, but it seems to be moving in the right direction because the fatalities, again, were down 38% across the board in Alberta for the 2024 and into 2025. Now, to address the reality that over 60% of fatal drug poisonings occur in private suburban residences, often involving individuals using substances entirely alone, the province deployed two unique modern interventions. First, the Digital Overdose Response System, also known as DOORS, and that is a mobile app. The app allows individuals to initiate a countdown timer before using substances alone. If they fail to respond to the automatic check-in, an emergency dispatch protocol is instantly initiated, and that'll route STAR's air ambulance or municipal EMS directly to their geolocation. By early 2026, the DOORS app recorded over 4,200 active users, resolving hundreds of life-threatening emergency escalations. Again, saving lives, and that matters. Second, Alberta has pioneered on-demand access to long-acting opioid agonist medications through the Virtual Opioid Dependency Program. By completely eliminating daily user fees for publicly funded treatment beds and providing immediate 120-day financial coverage for high-tech medications like Sublocade, that is a monthly slow-release injectable that effectively blocks opioid cravings and shields the brain against accidental fentanyl toxicity. Alberta has removed traditional financial barriers to stabilization. Again, a big step forward. Yet, the most legally and ethically charged pillar of the Alberta model arrived with the recent introduction of the Compassionate Intervention Act. This historic legislation fundamentally shifts the legal landscape, allowing adult family members or guardians or peace officers to petition the court for a mandatory involuntary treatment order for individuals whose severe substance use disorders render them an immediate danger to themselves or to the community. This is backed by prominent figures like Dr. Anna Lemke of Stanford University. The act is framed by the government as a desperate, compassionate last resort to save lives. Conversely, civil liberties organizations and harm reduction advocates argue that mandated detention violates basic constitutional frameworks and can spike post-release mortality due to sudden tolerance drops. Essentially, when someone goes into a forced treatment, they are using this much amount of drugs within the hip or the intake, and then when they come out, their body has been deprived of it, so their tolerance level has reduced. When they take that same amount they were using prior to being in treatment or going through detox, now the body can't handle that level because it's adjusted itself. And therefore, that results in overdoses, and something that you see in different aspects. But it's not just in that program; it's all detox and treatment programs where people have gone without, and then they go back to using the same amount. Again, that can cause a major problem. As we navigate the deep complexities here, folks, we want to just give another sponsor recognition. And that, again, is recognizing the organizations dedicated to smooth execution in our daily lives. And Primetime Live is proud to be sponsored by Carey Movers Limited. A trusted name in logistics and relocation, Carey Movers handles your most challenging transitions with care and absolute integrity. Whether it's moving a treasured family home or executing a complex commercial logistics, the elite crews ensure that your cargo and your items arrive safely and, of course, efficiently. Discover how easy your next move can be by visiting www.careymovers.com. That's www.karymovers.com, or give them a call at 604-687-1746. Thanks again to Carey Movers for sponsoring this episode again. As we move on, though, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at the human and economic toll. Because no geographic assessment of Alberta's drug problem can be complete without confronting a brutal, historic, systemic disparity. The toxic drug crisis is not an equalizer. It preys with devastating asymmetry on Indigenous communities. First Nations peoples across Alberta represent approximately 6% of the overall provincial population, yet they routinely account for upwards of 22% of all recorded opioid toxicity deaths. This horrific overrepresentation is a direct manifestation of intergenerational trauma, systemic gaps in rural healthcare infrastructure, and of course, historical displacement. It is precisely why Recovery Alberta's current build-out includes 5 dedicated recovery centers managed in direct structural partnership with Indigenous nations, recognizing that recovery cannot be colonialized. It must be rooted in cultural healing, in community integration, and localized sovereignty. Beyond the unimaginable human grief, the economic drag of this crisis is threatening to buckle municipal budgets. In the major urban centers of Calgary and Edmonton, emergency services are strained to their absolute breaking limits. Police and crisis response teams, known as PACT, which pair specialized mental health clinicians with frontline police officers, operate around the clock to divert individuals away from the overburdened emergency rooms and provincial remand centers. The justice system has been forced to adapt through the major expansion of drug treatment courts. These specialized courts offer nonviolent offenders whose criminal acts were directly motivated by the underlying addictions a stark choice: face immediate incarceration or enter an intensely monitored, judicially supervised program of comprehensive long-term substance abuse treatment. It is an acknowledgement that we cannot simply arrest our way out of a public health catastrophe, even within an abstinence-focused model. But the economic damage cascades further into local business communities. Business revitalization zones in downtown Edmonton, Red Deer, and Calgary have spent years absorbing the realities of public injection, vandalism, and safety concerns. Property owners have been forced to allocate millions of dollars collectively towards private security infrastructure, insurance premiums, needle disposal protocols, all while balancing compassion for an unhoused population suffering from multi-layered psychiatric and physical trauma. The drug problem in Alberta is not merely a clinical diagnosis. It is a macroeconomic anchor dragging down the vitality of the province's commercial corridors. Something that we're seeing throughout North America and around the globe in those communities that are impacted by this. Now let's take a look at what is the path forward, ladies and gentlemen. What are the final thoughts here? Because as we bring this hour-long investigation to a close, what is the ultimate verdict on the status of Alberta's drug problem in 2026? The reality escapes easy political categorization. The numbers show an undeniable victory in the raw reduction of overall fatalities throughout the late areas of 2024 and 2025. That when government builds a massive, accessible, and completely synchronized pipeline towards treatment, thousands of people will choose that path and survive. The elimination of daily user fees, the virtualization of rapid access medication, and the build out of comprehensive recovery communities are genuine milestones that other provinces are now actively studying. And it's not just other provinces. There are US states and countries around the world that are watching this Alberta project. Huge importance outside of just Alberta. Yet the crisis remains fiercely resilient. The explosive rise in carfentanil contamination and the clinical complexities of benzodope reveal that the unregulated street supply is more toxic than at any point in Canadian history. The policy pivot has created a high-stakes ecosystem for those who enter the recovery pipeline. There is a clear path forward. For those left outside that pipeline, the margins of survival has shrunk to almost zero. Now, as we wrap up, ladies and gentlemen, we need to bring forward that journalistic integrity demands that we look at this not as a battle of political models, but as an ongoing struggle for human lives. There are no simple conclusions to be drawn. Here on May 21st, 2026, Alberta has shown courage in choosing an entirely different path than the rest of the nation. But the final metric of success cannot be measured in the number of treatment beds built. It must be measured in the long-term sustained healing of its people. Before we sign off, once again, we'd like to give our deepest gratitude to Carey Movers, our broadcasting partner. Please support the companies that keep independent, deep dive journalism alive on Jess Tv, on Jess FM, and other channels online and in the traditional sense. Visit them at www.karymovers.com. That's careymovers.com. Thank you for joining us tonight on Primetime Live. I'm James Cousineau. Stay safe, stay informed, and have a good night. We're wrapping up a little early as we didn't hear the phones ringing tonight, and I hope that you found this episode very helpful. Don't forget to leave your thoughts below if you're watching this on a repeat on demand. By all means, leave your comments. We do visit the comment sections quite frequently and keep up with that. And if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to us as well. Once again, if you or someone that you love is in crisis, pick up the phone and dial 988 in Canada or in the United States. For other organizations around the world, you can Google the different resources for addiction and recovery. And getting treatment and getting your life back on track. Once again, you've been watching James Cousineau here on Jess FM and Jess TV. We hope to see you next week, Thursday night, 8 p.m. Mountain Time, 7 o'clock Pacific. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Stay safe.